Hi, and welcome back to the Healthy and Happy podcast. Super glad that you joined us today, and we've got a really great guest today who's a clinical psychologist in the LA area, and just in the little bit that I visited with her and stalked her a little bit on Instagram, she's got great things to offer, and I'm really excited for our chat. And so thank you for joining us. So Ingrid, tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a trauma therapist in the Los Angeles area, like you said, and I'm an author. My first book was published about 10 years ago. Never thought I'd write another one that was very research-based and academic, called Recovering Spirituality. And then about 5 years ago, I was literally just called to do this writing that I didn't know what it was for many years. It was stories about my own childhood, ways that I've struggled as an adult. I thought, am I writing about what it's like to be a flawed therapist? Like I just didn't know for a long time. And it was several years in when I could finally see all of this writing, all these different essays that I wasn't sure how they hung together, that I was writing about childhood trauma, the trauma responses that I lived with for many decades, and then trauma healing. And, even though I am a trauma therapist, I could not own and identify my own trauma. And I think it's in part, well, for a lot of reasons. One is that often I think we minimize our trauma in childhood, partially because you just don't know any different. You're like, well, I guess this is pretty normal, and you hear stories of things that, I don't know why we do this to ourselves, but we have this like trauma measuring stick, which is like, your trauma sounds worse than mine. Mine must not count or matter. Mine's only
a 5. It's not that valid. Right? Yeah.
And, also what I now know is that my trauma was growing up with a narcissistic stepfather. And so a big part of narcissistic abuse is the gaslighting, which is to say to a child with a developing brain, that didn't happen, and if it did happen, it's no big deal, or it's your fault, or all these things. And so I was internalizing all of that and going through life and going to see a lot of therapists along the way. I've sat on a million couches, and no one else told me that sounds like narcissism or narcissistic abuse, or, are you familiar with trauma? And so here I was decades later writing my own story. And one day I looked at it in black and white from a trauma therapist perspective. And I thought, oh my word,
wow,
this is what this is. And if I'm walking around for all these years thinking, maybe I'm just a little more damaged than most, and all of these interventions that I've done to try to get over it and rise above and overcome, and I've done all the things, I've taken the retreats, I've been sober for almost, I don't even know, 3 decades now.
Gotten all the education.
3 degrees. I mean, ongoing trainings. And I still didn't know how many other people are walking around with unresolved trauma, with trauma responses that they don't even know that they're trauma responses, and what it takes to actually heal from that stuff. So my new book is out now as of last month in September. It's called Believing Me, Healing from Narcissistic Abuse and Complex Trauma. And it's a memoir, because even though I'm a clinician, I think partly why I couldn't see my own story is because I didn't think the clinical terms applied to me. And so when I share my story and other people see themselves in the specifics, even if they don't have the exact story, it's the feelings, it's what it conjured in me, it's what that looked like in the rest of my life. They relate to all of that. And suddenly my process of believing me is helping them to believe themselves. And, because I'm a clinician, I couldn't help but put a big old glossary in the back of the book with all the relevant clinical terms that I think are relevant anyway, and a list of resources and other things so that people can use it as a jumping off place to hopefully do the work.
That's really awesome. And you hit on several really important things, but I want to highlight a couple there and then ask a couple of further questions about a couple of other things. One is what you said about not realizing as a child what's going on. And for those of you that don't know, developmentally, really until early adolescence, what we live is just what is normal.
Yeah.
And for most people around age 13, there's a really important shift that takes place into formal operational thought. And formal operational thought really marks the beginning of identity formation, and is the easiest definition that I know of is really the ability to think about thinking and to metacognate. And so the shift during adolescence is the first time really where most of us are able to start analyzing a little bit what the experiences that we've lived. The research shows that before then, the brain works very categorically. And when you're, at school, you're at school. And when you're playing sports, you're playing sports. And when you're with your stepdad, you're with your stepdad. And there are these very categorical kind of areas of our lives. And so we don't know that what we're living is trauma. We don't know that what we're experiencing is not just, not that big of a deal. And then if you've got a narcissist that is happily minimizing what you're experiencing and blaming and gaslighting, then it's so easy to transition into adulthood and never really integrate or understand what it is that you've lived.
That's right.
And I think there's so many people who I don't know what the right word is, minimize or just really don't understand the gravity of what they have lived and the validity of the feelings that they've had.
That's right. And I think so many of us too are, kind of wanting to give the benefit of the doubt and sort of go, well, maybe they didn't really mean it. And I'm going to put it in context. And, the other piece, in addition to the just developmentally, what it's like growing up in childhood, what I've really come to understand is that I didn't know everything that was going on in my childhood, but I knew my stepdad was not a nice person, and I knew what he was doing was wrong. But I thought that because I knew, quote unquote, what happened, and that I didn't like it, and that I was going to sort of, overcome it, I thought because I knew it was going to give me immunity from any sort of like after effects, right? Because, and I turned to intellectualism, like, I'm going to figure this thing out, right? Like I also grew up in an alcoholic home, both my biological parents and their spouses, lots of alcoholism. My whole family tree is just like pickled, and in 8th grade even, so what was I, 12, 13 years old, the first research paper we were asked to write, we could have chosen any topic. I chose alcoholism, the family disease.
You did?
I did.
Wow.
I did. And so I was trying to figure this thing out. Like I knew that it was off. I knew that it was wrong. And again, I thought that understanding something, being able to tell the story, I've told my story a million times. What I didn't know is that all of that is coming from the prefrontal cortex, the last part of the brain to develop. It's very rational, intellectual. And guess what? It's offline when you experience trauma. First of all, when you're in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, all unnecessary parts of the body are shut down. Digestion. It's like the body's not interested in your opinion on something. It's interested in survival. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is that even though I knew these things, my nervous system was growing and developing in what essentially was this toxic environment. And that learning speaks its own language. So the very subtle ways that I adapted and coped that I didn't know that I was adapting and coping. And suddenly I just think this is my personality, this people pleasing and perfectionism. And really it's an outgrowth of trauma. But we assume these things are just our personality. And it's not, right? So it's so much more complicated than I ever realized. I thought I had it all figured out at 13, right? I'm going to write this.
You wrote the paper
and it didn't save me. It didn't save me, you know?
That's such an interesting and important point. You know, in my work with people, and trauma work, I talk a lot about like the fact that when we get triggered, our frontal lobes are offline, you know, and when we're in that emotionally flooded state, all those things that happen. But I don't know that I've ever connected the dots or thought about the fact that that part of our brain is offline when we experience the trauma, when it's created. And so that disconnect between what we're experiencing neurologically in the rest of us and what we're experiencing in whatever part of our frontal lobes are developed at the time of the trauma that's a really good point.
It's so huge. And it's why traditional talk therapy that doesn't have a trauma informed, at least, perspective, you know, I can't tell you how many hours I sat on the couch looking for insight. I had so much insight and so much compassion, right? I had therapists that were genuinely wanting to be helpful and so compassionate. But it's like I say in my book that it was like gardening with kitchen scissors, and I just kept cutting off the weeds, not knowing that it was branching underground and getting deeper and deeper, you know, with these roots. So you have to work with the root system, which is the whole nervous system. It's a body-based thing. Trauma is in our cells.
Yeah.
And again, they're not looking for my opinion. They learned my nervous system learned what it learned, it adapted. And now I have to work with it that way. And it's different. It's really different from, like I said, traditional talk therapy. And I never knew that.
Right. No, traditional training doesn't do a good job of that either.
No, they don't. At least not in my day. I'm hearing whispers that they're doing a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of us have been out of the training mode for a while, right?
Yeah.
I finished my doctorate in 2002.
Okay. Bravo.
Yeah, 20 years is a long time. I keep thinking about that this year because that's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to ask what the question in my mind. As you went through this writing experience and started having some of these realizations and light bulbs going off, what were some of the key things that helped you recognize what you had been missing?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. So one key thing that actually the writing was the thing that brought this awareness is that whenever I went to therapy, I would tell like the stepdad story, but what I was most interested in is really how and why that lived in me. Why did every relationship I ever got into, it was the same relationship with a different face? It was like they were completely unavailable out of the gates, but then they were most likely a liar or a cheater or an active alcoholic or these various things, coupled with that was like my dating life. And then I had this pattern that kept playing out of older, often married men that were in some sort of power position, professor, bosses, all kinds of things, that we had this sort of mentor, maybe relationship, and then it would always cross the line. They would always try to pursue me in a way that was inappropriate. And I'm like, why does this keep happening? I genuinely ask, do I have a sandwich board that I'm wearing into the world that I don't know about that says I'm looking for a corrective experience? Or, I have no self-worth and I'm looking for a relationship to exploit me somehow. I couldn't figure it out. And so a couple key things became so important for me to understand. More than a couple. So we'll see which ones I get to. But to understand the language and experience of the fawning trauma response was so huge. Okay. So a lot of people know fight, flight, or freeze, but fawning is a bit of a lesser known. And it's very common for childhood trauma survivors with sort of, alcoholic, narcissistic, overbearing, that kind of dysfunctional family life. And basically what it is the people pleasing, the codependency. I prefer the term fawning actually to codependency, because codependency, first of all, comes out of the addiction world. I think that language has become so stigmatized. I've known about codependency my whole life, and I was like, I'm not codependent. What are you talking about? Right? Like, again, I go back to that paper that I wrote. I was like, I'm not codependent. I'm calling the behavior out. But really what was the fawning trauma response? Because again, the body only cares about survival. So if I'm living in a home where I get very clearly that I have to make sure your needs are met in order for me to even exist in my own home, because the silent treatment was wielded against me, all kinds of things. I won't get into that, but I developed a pretty hardcore fawning trauma response, which really is, it can, on the healthy end, fawning can look like being of service or kind of altruistic, but it's stuck in that fawning trauma response. It's literally abandoning ourselves in service of others. And we end up doing it not just in abusive relationships, but every relationship. And so here's the thing I didn't realize. I genuinely found safety, at least safer. Okay. I felt safer when I was fawning, when I'm scanning the environment. What are the cues? What do I need to be right now? What's going to keep me safe? I learned a sense of being as safe as I possibly could in a fawning response. So you know what we need as a fawner in order to feel safe? To be exploited, to be abused, to be right. And so that was why I didn't consciously know, of course not. I would find myself in this dynamic over and over and over. And when I understood, like, it could make me cry right now. I'm speaking so fast. I'm sorry. It's a lot.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
When I finally understood that I wasn't damaged and broken and unlovable, and there was literally nothing wrong with me because my body was doing exactly what our genius, brilliant bodies are meant to do, which is to keep us safe, it was such a relief. I made sense to myself for the first time ever. So learning about fawning, which Pete Walker is a brilliant psychotherapist in complex trauma. He coined that term. His writing about it, I think, is so helpful. So that was a biggie. And it's one that, when I work with folks, when we can understand ourselves from a trauma response perspective, it's not shaming. That's the other thing about the codependency language and world that I can feel a little, it's this idea of just have a little self-esteem, just set some healthy boundaries. Well, let me tell you, if you grew up in an environment like I grew up in, healthy boundaries will annihilate you.
Right.
That is the most unsafe thing you can do. And so if my body is conditioned in that environment, even to this day, to set a healthy boundary, it's like the hardest work. It takes so much. And so I like to ground all of these things in the reality of what our body is coping with. And then people go, well, yeah, that is how it feels. And it does make sense to me why it's so hard. Again, it's not this cognitive thing. Who doesn't want to set healthy boundaries? Who doesn't want to have self-love and self-worth?
Who wants to be taken advantage of, right?
Yes, exactly. I wanted to relive this relationship, multiple times over
and over again. Yeah, it was so fun the first time. I think I'll do it a few more times.
Right. So we come by these things so honestly, and understanding the real roots gives us an opportunity to go, oh, my nervous system is really dysregulated. This boundary feels like life or death. And I go, it makes sense that it feels like life or death, because That's what it was. The stakes felt that high, right? And then I can like check in with a therapist or friends or other survivors and go, are the stakes that high right now? Right? I can get a bit of a reality check around it. And if I can go, okay, no, it's safe for me not to go to this party. I mean, that's the thing.
Right.
So, okay, so how can I give myself lots of self-compassion, utilize the skills and the tools that I have to help regulate my nervous system? Then I can do it differently. But there's like a lot of scaffolding that has to go around this thing before we can erect the building of like healthy boundaries.
Around something as simple as not going to a party,
stuff.
right?
That's right. It's small stuff. Yeah.
I want to just kind of punctuate also what you said and point out to our listeners that what you said about in order for a fawner to feel safe,
that's right.
He or she has to be in a relationship with someone that's exploiting them or taking advantage of them or pushing boundaries or minimizing or devaluing.
That's right.
And many of you may be thinking, well, why would that be the case? And the reason is, and you said it, but I just want to punctuate it, is that our two, every single one of us has two primary needs that are with us throughout our lives, and that is self-worth, which our brains assess as, do I matter? Do I matter to those to whom I should matter? And a sense of love and belonging, which our brains assess as, am I safe? Am I emotionally safe? And when those needs are being met, we don't tend to pay very much attention to them. But when they're not, we will do something. Our brains will do something to try and get those needs met, to try to matter and to try to feel safe. And so if your brain has been wired in this fawning way, then the way to feel safe is by managing an unhealthy situation. That is successfully managing somebody who is unsafe is how that brain feels safe.
And I remember that feeling, or like, there's another saying that I discovered throughout this writing process that I love, which is that red flags don't look like red flags when they feel like home.
Exactly.
So when I would get what others might see as a traditional red flag, I would get a little excited. Yeah. I would get a little excited because I was like, oh, I know how to help you with that. I know how to fix that. Oh, you can't get a job, or you don't have any friends, or, whatever it is. It was like, you have a need that I genuinely feel like I can meet. It was like, oh, this is fantastic, right? That's what my body was doing. My mind was like, oh man, they don't have a job. Right. That's probably not going to go over really well. But I'm telling you, it felt like genuine excitement. And so the other language that what we're speaking to that I thought of early on when you asked me the question is the experience of trauma bonding and how that gets confused for love. And so trauma bonding is this hormonal concoction that happens when you're raised with these low lows, and then it's intermittent reinforcement. It's what they do in Vegas, right? It's like, you're going to put your money in, you get nothing. You're getting the silent treatment. You're ignored, you're manipulated, you're gaslit. But one day my stepdad would say, hey, do you want to go out for lunch? Can I buy you some jewelry across the street? Right. And suddenly I went from like not existing in my own home to feeling so special. It was like I went from black and white to being in color. I hated him for it because intellectually I'm like,
here, yeah.
Right. But in my body, it's like I could finally breathe. And
you were seen.
I was seen. And not just seen, but with love bombing from a narcissist, you're really seen. Like they're going to meet like every need. It's like you won the jackpot. That's what it's like.
It's the payoff.
It's the payoff. And so that trauma bonding cycle was also wired into my system. So when I would come to meet someone and it felt like, okay, you're letting me know you're not available. Boom, I'm in,
Right.
Now,
That's the way I'm supposed to be treated.
yeah, exactly. That's familiar to me, right? Familiar is so important to the nervous system, even if it's dysfunctional familiar. And then this dynamic would start to play out where I'm waiting for the payoff. I'm waiting for the payoff. And it's like an addiction, this trauma bonding. And so many people confuse it for love. And this is why it's also so hard to leave, because, and you can maybe speak more about this, when you're in this trauma bonding cycle, again, if the brain is wired towards safety, we may have been ignored or abused or in that low place for, it doesn't even matter, for a long, long, long time. The second that you get the reward, the brain associates the person who saved you with safety. Now, the person who saved you is also your abuser. And so long-term memory gone. The months and months or years of bad behavior before that moment gone. The brain goes,
This feels so good.
And that I need this person to survive. And so when we look at survivors of all kinds of abuse and we go, well, why don't they just leave? This is another reason why they don't just leave. They genuinely feel in their body, and they've been whittled down their self-worth to practically nothing. And now this person is exploiting that and coming along and telling their whole body that they need the abuser to survive. And it is powerful. It's so powerful, this trauma bonding and what it does to our insides. And so again, understanding these things, it's just like we can finally go, I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. I make sense. There is a way to the other side. If I look at this from a trauma perspective, and I'm not just forcing myself to suddenly do it differently and raise myself. It's just like, gosh, that stuff is just garbage when I think about it. It breaks my heart. You're blaming the victim.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the main things there is what you kind of keep mentioning or alluding to, which is that it's not just about your brain.
No.
Right? If you don't incorporate your nervous system and the body into this, and I mean, we don't walk around just as heads, right? We're
right.
a complete system. And so often in these things, we don't incorporate the entire system. And that, I hope you all noticed and noted that the importance of familiarity, because it feels like home, and home feels good. Home feels normal.
That's right. It feels normal.
And it's super powerful. I was also just going to say too, I mean, that the attachment literature also really ties into this. And it's one of the things that happens with an anxious or preoccupied attachment style is this belief system that, because there again, attachment style is about the rule book that we follow when we feel disorganized emotionally. When the attachment system gets turned on, the attachment style is the rule book that says how we cope in those moments. And the preoccupied or the anxious person says, well, I've got to monitor, I've got to make sure, I've got to reassure, and goes into that. I haven't seen, that's just kind of an interesting, I would think that there would be a real high correlation between fawning and anxious attachment.
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there are people talking about it. Attachment styles, for whatever reason, every time I've learned about it, I go, yes, that makes so much sense. And then it doesn't stay in my brain. So for whatever reason, it's not like the way that I'm meant to think about stuff. But I know a lot of people are drawing those connections, and it's powerful.
Yeah. Well, and you're speaking the language. It's just
right. I just don't know which one applies to which style. I don't know what it is about it.
But one of the things that happens with an anxious attachment style is that they associate love and safety and mattering with this feeling of disorganization. Right. Because the anxious person doesn't get reorganized emotionally. And
Yeah.
so they stay heightened. And so the brain and body associate that with love.
Mm.
And so then when they're in an attachment relationship that actually works,
Yeah.
when their attachment system gets deactivated and they
Yeah.
get reorganized emotionally, they think that something is wrong.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not supposed to feel safe with this, really safe. I'm not supposed to feel safe. I'm not supposed to feel organized emotionally. This is boring.
Yeah. No, I'm really candid in my book, even because I was married before, and I explore how well that went. And when I met my now husband, I had never felt so at ease. And I was like, I want to talk to him forever, and I want to spend time with him, but I think he's meant to be a friend. Like,
right.
Clearly can't be a romantic relationship because it feels too easy. And I'm so grateful that I was interested enough that I kind of kept showing. I was like, okay, maybe we're just friends, but I want to see you tomorrow. You know what I mean? It was like, okay. And until I got comfortable enough that my nervous system started to really, it was like I could exhale. Like, now we've been together for 10 years. It's the safest, best, most rewarding, healthy relationship of my life. We all have our stuff. I'm not saying it's perfect. But it is markedly different than any relationship I'd ever had before. And I have this amazing mentor in my life. And before I moved things forward with my now husband, I went to him and I said, I don't know about this guy. And he said to me, he goes, Ingrid, you've always been working so hard to make the wrong guys right. And now you're working really hard to make the right guy wrong. And I was like, really? Like, it was actually so nice to hear, because I was like, okay, I do need to trust your nervous system a little bit more than I'm going to trust mine here, because my track record is not so good. So if you're telling me that, no, this sounds like healthy, then I'm gonna keep doing it. And man, am I glad that I did.
Did that healthy relationship open up space for some of these realizations, or did the realization open up space for the healthy relationship, or both?
I mean, so what we say in trauma healing, which I think is just generally true, is that healing is not linear, right? We don't just get better and better over time, climbing the hill. Here I go. It's more cyclical. And so I've come around the bend in lots of different ways over time. And so I think I had done enough healing to kind of meet my husband and go, okay, let's do this thing. And then he and I were together about 5 years when the writing came. I have no doubt that foundationally, and we had a son who's now 7. And I think to create my own home and my own family and feel some real stability in that played a huge role in my ability to get these other like brain dumps of like, but what about all the other unhealed stuff that's still wanting to like be looked at and worked through. And the other thing I'll say is I know that the writing in part happened because my stepfather died. And I literally felt safer on this earth than I had ever felt. And I don't know if I could have ever done this if he was still alive, and he was married to my mom until the day he died. So he was.
So that's what I was going to ask. He was still married to her.
Yes, because, he convinced her that I was the liar and the manipulator, and I made it all up. And so once he was gone, it was like, wait a second, like there's all this other, I have this relationship that I always wanted, but I still feel pretty broken and, anxious. And I didn't know it was hypervigilant and emotional flashbacks and all these other things. So yeah, it's been a 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, do a jig to the left.
Right. How old were you when he came into your life?
Well, I was a baby because originally he was my dad's best friend.
Oh.
So, that's how he came into the picture. But when he was with, like, it was kind of like my mom and dad got divorced and she moved in with him like right away. And I was 11 or so. Yeah. So he was there forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that I would really, really like to communicate to our listeners is that there is hope.
There is hope. Oh my
There's
God.
change.
Yes. Yes. Through the writing of this book and then putting these pieces in place and getting more information and doing more specific trauma therapy, I mean, there's beyond hope. I feel like in some ways, okay, fine. It took me to my mid 40s, but I am finally knowing my true self. And it's the most powerful thing I've ever done. The more sort of trauma response that can fall away, and I could see more aspects of the real me. And then if I see the real me, the choices that I make during the day are subtly different, and how I take care of and honor myself. And there's more than hope. There's a brilliant, beautiful life waiting, but I also never sugarcoat it. And I really share my whole process in the book, Believing Me. It is also the hardest thing I've ever done. Trauma healing, and here's the truth, right? Because what you said, developmentally, we weren't able to really digest what was actually happening. Then we have all the coping mechanisms that stopped us from feeling all that stuff, maybe like for me, for decades. So when you actually move in to the healing and you go into those roots, you got to go to the depth of the feeling that you never, ever, ever, ever wanted to feel. Who would want to? And yet it's a part of what we have to do to move through. So the healing can hurt harder than the wound. And I still say it's the best thing I've ever done. I think it's worth it, hands down. So yeah.
Well, then it opens up, it opens up space for newness.
That's right.
And if you don't do that, then in one way or another, you're just going to keep getting more of the same.
That's right. And people go, well, oh, but maybe it's just easier then to like live in addiction and compulsive behavior and, isolation and all these things. I'm used to that. And I go, is it easier? Is it really? Because, not only, I didn't even know what I didn't know then. And I would still say, no, it was not easier. It was so painful. But knowing what I know now in terms of the gifts and the freedom and the opportunity that you get when you're on the other side, it's like, it just doesn't compare. It doesn't compare. It's not even a life lived. That's what it's like, the before and after.
Yeah, that's a really good way to say it. And I also just want to punctuate too that, so 80% of the brain gets wired by age 3, and about 90% of the brain gets wired by age 5. The remaining 10% gets wired by the time we're 25 to 27, latest research shows, frontal lobes being the last part. Mm-hmm. And so when these things get wired into us, into our bodies and our brains, we really are powerless.
Yeah.
A 6-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 13-year-old doesn't have power, really doesn't have power.
That's right.
And so that's what gets wired right into who we are and how we view the world. And so that doesn't just automatically change because now your body's all grown up.
Right.
That neurology still is the same. And so
I think I really believed that it would. I think I really believe
we do. That's why I'm saying that, because I think we do. And I think in lots of subtle ways, we kind of reinforce that, where we just kind of think that, when we become an adult, we'll have it figured out.
We'll have adult level functioning. Yeah. Exactly. We talk about adulting and everyone goes, well, how do you do that? Like
exactly.
I feel 5 because
I think that even like adulting or adult level functioning sends the wrong message, because I really think it's about healthy. Yeah. Right. Because way more adults are unhealthy than are healthy.
Unfortunately, true.
Yeah. And we're all unhealthy to degrees, right? But healthy doesn't just automatically happen. And I think that's really, really important. Yeah. Do you have your book handy?
I can get it.
Would you mind? Let's show everybody what it looks like.
I have so many reels on Instagram where I'm holding it up like, look, I did it. Leaving me. Yeah.
Yeah, there it is.
There it is.
Well, Ingrid, I have really, really enjoyed this time, and I really appreciate you joining us and the insight and the vulnerability. I mean, I think I said that before we started recording, but the vulnerability that you've shown in doing this is so brave and so helpful. And
thank you so much. Yeah.
Any kind of closing thoughts or remarks for our listeners?
I just think the biggest thing is, if you've ever felt like you're broken, the answer is you're not. You're not broken. And it just, you haven't found the right tools for the job, right? To sort of, like, we're talking about these big jobs of rewiring the nervous system and, shedding these trauma responses that we think are our personality. And yet it's so possible. I talk a lot about this on Instagram. It's a free resource. Go see who I follow, because I follow a ton of other people that are amazing and they're inspiring me every day. There's a community of folks that are doing this work. So you're not alone. You're not broken.
That's awesome. How do people find you?
My Instagram is at Ingrid Clayton, Ph.D. My website is Ingrid Clayton, Ph.D. The book is on Amazon. The ebook and paperback are currently out. Audible is going to have it hopefully by the end of November. I'm just finishing recording it. I'm narrating it. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us, and excellent stuff for our listeners.
Thanks for your time and the invitation. I appreciate it.